Okay, if I could have your attention. My name is Michael Lind. I'm the Policy Director of the Economic Growth Program, and it's my great pleasure to host this panel entitled Alternatives to Austerity. Before I begin, I have an important public service announcement. We are twittering the event at www.twitter.com/newamericancontract, and your host tag, for those of you who know what that means, is #EcoSym, #EcoSym. Back in 1939, when Hitler signed the Nazi-Soviet pact with Stalin, went in the British Foreign Office is alleged to have said, "All of the isms are wasms." And that thought came to me as I was thinking about the theme of this conference and of this particular panel. A lot of the certitudes and the assumptions that govern public discourse in the United States and other areas in the last decade or even generation are now cracking up and collapsing and capsizing. So it's a very dangerous and grim time for our nation and the world. But intellectually, it's more exciting, I think, than intellectual life and public discourse has been for many, many years. And we're particularly privileged to have a group of major thinkers and writers and public intellectuals and economic experts here to help guide our way from the wreckage of the isms, of the wasms, to what may in time be isms. Let me just say, building on something that New America's President Steve Call said earlier this morning, I think there's too much pressure in Washington and in public discourse for premature consensus. You know, everyone's always striving towards consensus and striving towards agreement. We want the consensus to be based on facts and on sound analysis. And to get to consensus, you need to go through dissensus. So that I hope we'll stir things up with this panel. The consensus may be down the road, but at least I hope we'll have some debate and discussion to illuminate the grave situation confronting us now. Liaquat Ahamed is director of Aspen Insurance Holding Unlimited, a board member of the New America Foundation and a former economist for the World Bank. And he's also author of Lords of Finance, The Bankers Who Broke the World, in a previous economic crisis. A book I highly recommend. He manages to take the somewhat intractable material of financial history and make it as fascinating and exciting as a novel. Rob Johnson is director of the Economic Policy Initiative of the Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt Institute, a blogger at New Deal 2.0, a former managing director of Soros Fund Management, and a former managing director of Bankers Trust Company, in addition to being former chief economist of the U.S. Banking Committee. Jim Jubak, a columnist I enjoy reading and have over the years, has been a columnist at MSN Money, former senior financial editor at Worth Magazine, and is author of the Jubak Picks, 50 Stocks That Will Rebuild Your Wealth and Safeguard Your Future, a book that I need to read. And Christopher Hayes is the Washington, D.C. editor of The Nation, a fellow of the New America Foundation, and author of a provocative new paper on overcoming America's debt overhang, the case for inflation. Liaquat.
Thank you, Michael. I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of the Fed in getting the economy back on track. Last year, the Fed played an exceptionally important role in preventing an economic collapse. It took a little while to recognize the dimensions of the problem, but once it did, it sprang into action and essentially saved us from something approaching the Great Depression. In three ways. One is traditional lender of last resort financing. Bankers were hoarding cash, refusing to lend to each other, and essentially the Fed acted as an intermediary. It took money from banks that wanted to hoard it and lent it to banks that needed it. And in the process allowed its balance sheet to go up 2.5 times. Secondly, just conventional monetary policy, cutting interest rates to the bone, essentially designed to offset the shock in confidence from the financial crisis and the shock and the collapse in consumer demand as consumers realized they were tapped out, raising savings rates and cutting their consumption. And thirdly, somewhat unusually, the Fed intervened quite extensively in credit markets by essentially lending against a whole range of assets that they don't usually lend against. This resulted in a dramatic change in the composition of the Fed's balance sheet. Usually the Fed holds treasury bills and treasury bonds, and you saw the Fed's balance sheet change dramatically. So if the Fed played such a critical role in preventing a meltdown, what is its role going to be in the recovery? Over the last 20 years, we have become used to a very activist Fed. The chairman of the Fed is something of a media star. We expect the Fed to essentially be the primary hand guiding the economy. That is going to change. For really two reasons. The first is that for some of the reasons outlined in the previous session, the growth in demand is going to be quite sluggish. Consumers are tapped out. Fiscal policy is just as a process of budgetary arithmetic is going to have to be somewhat contractionary over the next few years, which means that interest rates are going to have to remain very low for a very long time. Now, what do we mean by that? Just to give you an idea, the currently discounted in the market is the fact that the Fed will start raising interest rates next March and raise them essentially by somewhere between 100 and 150 basis points for the next 2 years. So what the market expects is a Fed that goes back to, that essentially takes interest rates back to 3% by the end of 2011. I would argue that's not going to happen. Really for three reasons. One is any measure, there's a rule for monetary policy known as the Taylor rule, which tries to relate the level of interest rates to the output gap, i.e. how much we are below full capacity and full employment, and inflation. And if you ran the Taylor rule today, it would tell you that interest rates had to be somewhere like minus 2%. Given that we're going to have a U-shaped recovery, the Taylor rule is not going to recommend 3% interest rates for many years. Another way to think about it is to go back to the Great Depression. The Fed cut interest rates, cut its discount rate to 1% in 1933. The discount rate remained at 1% for the next 20 years. Commercial paper rates remained, so this was the official rate, commercial paper rates, which was the market rate, remained at 1% until the early 50s. And for those 20 years, essentially, monetary policy was purely passive. All the Fed did was keep the price of credit very low, and the dynamics of the economy was in the hands of either the federal government or the private sector. If that is true, that interest rates have to remain very low for a very long time, what are we to make of all this talk about exit strategy? And here, essentially, the Fed is going to be pulling back, but it's not going to be pulling back on conventional monetary policy. It's going to be pulling back on the other two dimensions of what it did last year, which is one, it's going to be shrinking its balance sheet. And the reason for that is it expanded its balance sheet because banks refused to lend to each other. One measure of that is a thing called the TED spread, which measures the interest rate differential between what banks are willing to lend to each other and what the government can borrow at. Before the crisis, that would typically be around 20 basis points, 1/5 of 1%. At the worst, during the fall, that went up above 2%. That is currently back to 1/5 of 1%. So essentially, banks have regained confidence in lending to each other, in part because of the support the Fed has provided to the banking system. As a consequence, you will begin to see the Fed contracting its balance sheet over the next year, and there's already some evidence that they've done so. The second thing is the Fed's credit market interventions. Last year's crisis severely damaged some of the plumbing of the world's financial system, especially a part of the world's financial system that has come to be known as the shadow banking system, which are essentially institutions that function like banks, but are not core banks, and among them are money market funds, off-balance sheet conduits. This shadow banking system held large chunks of the securitized loans that got us into trouble. The Fed stepped in to try to counteract the collapse in credit availability as this market was shrinking. And perhaps that was necessary at the time. I think there's a growing view that is no longer true. There's a much more active debate going on, both within the Fed and outside, that trying to keep the sort of shadow banking system alive, or trying to keep these pipes going, is probably counterproductive, and it's in effect artificially sustaining a credit channel that is best left to atrophy. We've seen the Fed, for example, in the wake of Lehman. We saw the Fed intervene in the commercial paper market. It expanded its holdings of commercial paper from 0 to 200 billion. It's back to zero again because the commercial paper market's working again. We're going to see that same sort of contraction in the Fed's credit market activities over the next year. Bottom line, though, interest rates will remain between 0 and 1% for the next 5 years. Thank you.
Rob Johnson.
Michael, how many minutes do I have?
8 minutes, please.
Okay, I'm trying to be a financier who follows the rules. I'm trying to be a role model for the future. I think as I talk today, there are 3 dimensions that I want to focus on. One relates to ideas and ideology and how they limit what we can do. The second is a diagnosis of the debt overhang that is the theme of the conference. And then finally some remedies that relate to that, following the excellent work that was demonstrated on the last panel. I think we're in a period where the right has worshipped free markets, and they have reason to be doubting, and the left has worshipped, they've romanticized the capacities of government. And the Chicago school, through the mind of someone like George Stigler, has always been skeptical of government, while many what we might call Keynesian and new Keynesian economists have been quite skeptical of the sufficiency of markets to produce, as a means to produce social outcomes. So what I would say right now is we have a society that's somewhat demoralized because they have nothing to believe in. When we look at the capacity for policies, when I get to the section on remedies, those inhibitions will play a relatively large role. And I will also conclude that the mishandling of the bailouts, I believe on the last panel they talked about the United States being more like Japan than like the Scandinavians. I think that plays a role in feeding the skeptics about the capacity of government to do good on behalf of the society. Looking at the debt overhang, I'm very inspired by the work of Hyun Song Shin from Princeton, as well as the Carmen and Ken's work. Shin has decomposed in a NBR paper this summer the flow of funds, and he starts in 1954. He normalizes everything to one. And he said the household, non-financial sector, and commercial bank, life insurance company, and pension funds have hovered around growing by 80 times in terms of their financing. Whereas broker-dealers, the aspect of the market that we just heard referred to of securitization, grew to a peak of nearly 1,000 times. So you're talking about one sector grew more than 10 times as much as the others. The collapse of securitization and the stresses that have been associated with this spiraling deleveraging are actually exacerbated by very heavy concentration in the so-called too big to fail, kind of the large investment banks and banks. The reason I say that is that the externalities in a kind of oligopoly, everybody's attempt to delever put pressure on each other, and we started to spiral down. And it was really only the work of the Fed and the fiscal stimulus, the two dimensions. Actually, Jamie Galbraith referred to it as the guarantees with the fiscal stimulus that arrested this downward spiral. What I see now from the initial conditions is that non-financial business started this crisis in reasonably good shape. The one has to be careful of the old adage, averages are for the average, because much of non-financial business was very fragile, and a handful of very large companies were in very good shape, and that changes the average. But in comparison with both households and the financial intermediation sector, their balance sheet was in better shape. But that's a matter of time, because they rely on ultimate consumer demand. It appears, to use the kind of images that Simon Johnson has conjured up, that the strength of the financial oligarchy is redistributing the burden onto taxpayers and households. The ultimate cost of this crisis will obviously not only be the explicit cost of bailouts. And I must say, as I visit around the city, I found that most deficit hawks took a vacation underwater between October and March when the financial bailouts were done. And I wish we could, like driver's license, you get too many points on your license, they can take it away. I wish we could take away their tongues on deficit issues, because they missed several $100 billion of the game. But as we, and then as Carmen rightly emphasized, a very large proportion of the growth of debt has to do with the downturn and the automatic losses in revenue and increases in spending. Having said that, I still don't see the United States public sector in an extreme debt crisis. And I will have to be a little bit critical of the Chinese, because they have, as Paul Volcker said, they chose not to let their exchange rate rise. They chose to accumulate those assets. And now that they're our partner in that, I would say they are co-architects, not victims of U.S. Lack of discipline. And where I think that's particularly important is not so much the Chinese, because most of the people from China that I talk to are quite sensitive in this regard. It's that Americans use the Chinese like a hammer to try to discourage meaningful reforms in our public sector, with the specter of Chinese bailouts, or excuse me, not bailouts, Chinese selling out of assets in the United States as the reason not to do things. And that has a lot more to do with power struggles in the United States than with the impressions of the Chinese. When I would want to underline what I saw in Tom Palley's presentation about the debt dynamics, that the notion of a sustainable sustainable debt ratio. And he, by the way, he didn't cheat. He moved the public debt to GDP ratio up to 100. We started the year at something in the high 40s. And I guess in passing, the only note I'll make, it'll be very interesting to see how this administration handles the continuation of the GSE obligation or guarantees and how that relates to public debt discussions in the years to come. Moving on to the notion of remedies, I think the first one is we have what we have now, but we don't need another financial crisis. And as I will argue in writing over the next couple of months, too big to fail policy. You heard the president yesterday talking about resolution powers. Well, imagine like you're aboard ship and you're down below and you're the captain and they call you up on deck and they say there's a crisis. Well, if you have the resolution powers, it's like you have everything, like the rudder works, everything. But the problem is anybody who got the resolution powers they claimed they didn't have in February when they were dealing with Bank of America and Citibank, those resolution powers are probably not sufficient. What is absolutely necessary to be able to resolve too big, or what Ed Kane calls too difficult to fail or unwind firms, is very profound changes in derivatives regulation. Gary Gensler is doing superb work, much to the surprise of many who used to know that he used to work at Goldman Sachs. But the facts are, he is really pressing the case right now, and I want to applaud that. I was tempted to do a PowerPoint today, and I was going to start with 800 phone numbers for suicide prevention and depression counseling. So I got to come up with what good news I can. And Gary Gensler is a very substantial part of the good news. But when they talk about resolving too big to fail institutions, as opposed to forbearance, which protects creditors and exacerbates moral hazard, they really talk about how entangled and intertwined these institutions are, which deters them from resolving things. So that's why I say derivatives regulations would simplify and which make clear the nature of the entanglements will give policymakers more courage when they come up on the deck in the next storm. The second dimension is almost too obvious to talk about, which is the dynamics that people are talking about related to healthcare costs. When you look at the OECD study from 2007, the OECD average for quality healthcare among industrial countries was about $2,900 per capita. The United States is about $7,300. The World Health Organization ranks the United States as the 37th best healthcare system in the world. There is so much room for cost savings without rationing seniors in healthcare, and it does not appear we're on that trajectory, but it's an obvious place to start. There are existing models all over the world that work right. Finally, I would concur with those who emphasized public spending. And this is where I'll come back to ideology. Economists are always thought to think at the margin. In the era since Ronald Reagan of berating government, rightly or wrongly, a lot of our public infrastructure has been allowed to deteriorate. And so I believe at the margin, rebuilding that infrastructure, reducing transportation delays at airports or what have you, improving trains and subways and so forth, are complementary with an E to private sector productivity. But I think the litmus test for public sector investment, whether it relates to healthcare, whether it relates to education, what I'll call forms of human capital, or whether it involves tangible capital, is whatever the government spends on should be driven not by shovel ready or not by the question of who was powerful last week, but the question of how does this augment productivity? In essence, how do you service your debt in the medium term should be the litmus test. And I think being the father of a 4-month-old baby, I think doing something for future generations feels kind of good to me right now. Finally, I come back again to this notion of trust. Paul Krugman's article was mentioned, and Dr. John Cochran from Chicago criticized it rather vigorously. And on some grounds, I'm sympathetic by talking about the extent to which Krugman perhaps idealizes not what the government could do, but what it does do, what the real process, what the political economy is about. But the part where I fall short with Dr. Cochran's explanation is he accuses Paul Krugman of being paranoid for suggesting that economists might be attracted to sabbaticals at prestigious think tanks. They might be attracted to consulting deals. They'd rather go to Lake Como than change the oil in their car during the summertime. And I want to conclude by saying that economists are very good at specifying the incentives that pertain to everyone else's life, but they put themselves in a place like benevolent Martians. So my final recommendation in order to get this straight and straighten out the ideology is to understand that economists either have to adopt a more public spirit or they have to return to Mars. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. I think that if there were a 1-800 number for people to call for counseling to deal with economic depression, they would probably counsel the callers not to listen to our panelists. With that in mind, Jim,
I was wondering why you invited me to do what I said.
I'm going to tell you a little bit about something about what I do, because that will give you an idea of why I'm here and sort of inform what I'm going to suggest. For the last 13 plus years, I spent my days writing an investment column on the internet for MSN Money. I'm now, I guess we could say, syndicated, since I write for MSN Money on my own blog. Column reaches about 1 million, we don't call them readers in the internet world, unique users a month. And it being the internet, I started out in magazines where if you wrote a really, really controversial article, you maybe got 3 letters, and they'd come in about 3 months later and you'd go, what? What was that about? The internet, of course, is you could idealize it and say it's a conversation. What it really means is that the columnist is this very large bucket that receives endless numbers of email about the topic at hand, the topic offhand, whatever. But consequently, in this 13 years, I've developed a pretty good understanding of one part of the investment community. And these are people who are relatively active investors. They're not traders. I don't write for traders. The portfolios I run are like 12 to 18 month durations and longer. They're not your 401k investor. They're a little more active than that. But they're a really interesting cross-section of, not so much politics, they tend to be right of center, but they're a kind of interesting cross-section of public opinion. And that's what I'm interested in talking about right now. In some ways, they're really the ideal audience that politicians and some of the economists in this room wish we had. They tend to think relatively long-term. I mean, we have conversations with readers regularly that talk about, what's going to happen in 10 and 20 years. They are pretty good at putting all that stuff that the government keeps off balance sheet, future obligations, on their balance sheets. Since what they spend their time doing is trying to figure out, well, if I do this today, can I pay for retirement or college tomorrow? So they're very aware of the difference between the significance of what they do today and what's going to happen tomorrow. And they do pretty good mental bookkeeping. They have a sense of where they are in that scheme of things. Some of them actually run scenarios where they say, well, will I get to, my goal is $2 million by the time I'm ready to retire. If I save X and I get this return, will it get me there? And many of them recently have concluded, the answer is unfortunately no, that there's pretty much nothing they can do that will get them where they wanted to be before this financial crisis. And many of them don't see this financial crisis as a unique crisis. They see it as part of a crisis that includes the 2000 stock market crash. They don't really make the kinds of distinctions that we've routinely made, I think, here this morning and in our discussions. They see it as part of a global, long-term capital crisis, and it doesn't get them where they want to go. One of the things that's really interesting, this is where we start to get back to why I'm here today, is that their initial response to talk of the stimulus package was, across the ideological spectrum, excitement. Not because they were in favor of big government or not, but because they really liked the idea of investing in infrastructure. That the idea, it made sense to them that if you've got to find some way out of this hole we're in, it may not get you all the way you need to go, but increasing productivity, taking bottlenecks out of the economy were all good things. And the uniform response, again, to the stimulus package that actually passed was disappointment. Not so much, again, that the package was too large, too small, but the amount of money put toward the growth story was so small. And in fact, many of them basically have concluded, and I think rightly, that there is no growth story coming out of Washington right now. That it's all about short-term stimulus, it's all about balancing the budget or not balancing the budget. And what these people really want to hear is some kind of growth story which will let them get where they need to go, which is to retirement, to paying for college, to whatever that goal happens to be. And most of these folks have given up on the United States as being the source of that. I spend my time in the last 6 months looking at infrastructure stories in Australia or Indonesia. Brazil right now is a big favorite. We're writing and picking stocks in South American airlines because they're increasing the airport capacity. We're looking at global mining equipment companies, but most of these are outside the US. And I think there's a real lack of this story right now coming out of the US. And it's coming at a very bad time, if you will, if you look out as far as these people look, because they can see that there are major changes going on in the global financial markets, that China looks like it is gradually on a pathway to creating some kind of domestic market in long-term debt instruments. Not out of any sense that they need to rebalance the global economy, but because, hey, if you're looking at the kind of pension funding problem that they're looking at, what are you going to invest in if you don't have a corporate or any kind of long-term bond market? And they don't in China right now. So that's clearly something that's going to happen. But if you look at what we're looking at around the world, in an aging world, in a world where so many countries are competing for capital, for this group, the story really is, well, the United States doesn't make the cut. The growth story here isn't good enough. I'm not that interested in getting 1.23% on my money. It's just not good enough. So you buy Canadian royalty trusts. The only thing that gets any excitement out of readers right now is to buy natural gas pipeline master limited partnerships, because they're yielding about 8%. Infrastructure they can understand. Or you go overseas. Before the crash, people were looking for infrastructure investments in the same way. And I remember having this conversation. There's an Australian bank called Macquarie, which runs a number of dedicated infrastructure investment funds. One, in fact, is a U.S. fund. They owned a piece of the Chicago Skyway and this and that, and parking lots. And people were actually interested in looking at this, even though it wasn't the kind of infrastructure they wanted, because they believed in that story. I mean, anybody who rides the New Jersey Turnpike, I live in New York, so I spend some time on the Turnpike, knows that if you go from exit 9 which is roughly the shore exits for the Garden State Parkway, down to exit 6, you hit this real short stretch between around exits 7 and 8, where you spend an extra 20 to 30 minutes on a good day, because the turnpike goes from 8 lanes down to 6, down to 4. And you look at that and go, I mean, anybody can understand that that costs money. That waiting time is a waste of money in the economy. Every truck that goes to New York or to Philadelphia is paying this extra 20 minutes. And if you've ever done this on a Thanksgiving or a holiday weekend, you know that that's about an hour and a half to 2 hours between those 3 exits. Infrastructure makes sense to people. So what I think, there's an opportunity here, and I think a missed opportunity so far. I think there needs to be a growth story coming out of Washington. I think the Obama administration needs to come up with a way that says, yes, we believe that we can grow part of the way out of this problem, that we need to, if we're going to have better lives as opposed to worse lives for our kids, we need to invest. I think all those things are viable stories, and we're not making that argument now. Does that necessarily get us all the way to where we want to be? Do we need austerity? I think we need to be honest about it, saying it's only part of the solution. But politically, and if this is, I think, a reasonable cross-sector of people who vote, I think austerity by itself is a political dead end. It will not work. Nobody in their right minds would propose this as an election platform. And with repackaging it, I think there's some way to do that. One of the things that's really interesting to me is that there are many ways on the internet right now for people to invest without using Wall Street intermediaries. There are ways to repackage this. You could have an investment trust set up. You could use the model for state college funds. There are lots of mechanisms that could work to make a growth story that people would actually like to invest in. And I think you could actually build a kind of public-private partnership around the growth story. Thanks.
Thank you, Jim. At New America, we've been trying to get this message out about the importance of a growth story, in particular with infrastructure-led growth as the center of it. Bernard Schwartz and Cheryl Schwinninger have written several essays on this subject, which you can
Thanks, Michael. Jim and I write for slightly different audiences, but I share. I know exactly what he means about writing for the internet, and I would say to any of you, if you feel that you're receiving too little email, you should consider writing an essay advocating for inflation and posting it on the internet, because you'll get some stuff in your inbox. I'm not an economist. I'm first and foremost a journalist. I think Steve Cull, if he's still here, would sort of understand what I say when I say that makes me essentially a knowledge arbitrageur. So I don't actually produce knowledge. I just sort of find markets in which something is undervalued, and I buy it, and then I go sell it to the readership. It also means that I'm more comfortable making arguments in other people's voices. So I want to start with a quote that comes from around the period that Michael mentioned. Actually, the term Gilded Age, of course, comes from a novel that was co-written by Mark Twain in 1873, and this is the pronouncement of a character in that novel. He says, "Beautiful credit, the foundation of modern society. I wasn't worth a cent 2 years ago, and now I owe $2 million." So I repeat this quote to make the point, the obvious point, and the one that Carmen was making before, which is that periods of boom, bust, financial crisis, and massive private sector deleveraging are not new, of course, and that deleveraging tends to come with intense deflationary pressures, and the deflationary pressures tend to put extra stress on the class of debtors. In fact, it was those deflationary pressures that created the political movement that produced William Jennings Bryan, who warned the East Coast bankers not to push a crown of thorns down upon the brow of labor. Now, that did not get him very far. He lost, of course, in 1896, but actually, on the merits, he was right. The U.S. was saved largely by an influx of gold in the late 1890s from South Africa around the Boer War, and actually from Alaska, the Alaskan gold rush, and it increased the monetary base and leavened a little bit of the debt overhang and allowed for a growth period that went through the 1907 crisis. The economist Greg Mankiw, who is, some of you might know, writes a very popular blog and was an economist in the Bush administration, quite conservative by his own reckoning. he recently wrote that the most effective thing that FDR did, and of course this is sort of coming from a monetarist line, the most effective thing Roosevelt did in combating the Great Depression was abandoning the gold standard. And he says that the abandonment of, quote, price stability, the words that guide half the mandate of the Fed, would be the modern abandonment of the gold standard. So the point I want to just make there is that this boom-bust cycle, the period of private sector deleveraging, the pressure placed by deleveraging on debtors through these deflationary pressures is a common cycle, and that the way out of those crises often come with sometimes, in the case of the day, radical monetary loosening. And I think we're in a similar situation now. Now, there is a broad spectrum of economists, including Mankiw himself, who has advocated this idea, most sort of strenuously advocated by Ken Rogoff, who basically say that one way to edge out from the debt overhang is to embrace a period of what I call in the paper moderate and sustained inflation. Now, moderate and sustained do a fair amount of work in that formulation, as I'm aware. I want to not go too far into this because I wrote a whole paper on it and I'm probably a better writer than a talker, but I would say that it's, I think, important to recognize, if I can use a metaphor here, the role that a relaxing of the price stability requirement would play in recovery, which is to say, I do not think that inflation in and of itself is going to solve anything. In fact, presumably you could get some really crazy commodity inflation, and that wouldn't necessarily help people. But if people here are baseball fans, the way that I would think about it is this: standing in the on-deck circle, Albert Pujols, when he's taking his practice swings, there's this donut, which is a little lead weight about this big, which is put on the bat. And the idea behind the donut is that before you go up to the plate, you sort of psychologically make yourself feel like you're swinging a heavier thing, and then you take that off and you feel this kind of burden come off, and then you go up to the plate and you swing and you have more power. So the deflationary pressures of the current economy in this metaphor are the donut, right? They're not Albert Pujols, and they're not the bat, right? Which is to say that the actual way out of the debt overhang is, I think, and obviously I'm biased, is some sort of public investment-led infrastructure spending, growth undertaking, industrial policy, call it what you will, of the kind that's been sketched by Scherl and Bernard Schwartz. That's essentially the Pujols in the metaphor. But it's going to be very hard to get to actually swing the bat freely and have that carry through if essentially this monetary restraint remains on the bat. Now, Liaquat made me feel very optimistic, actually, because I think a universe in which something like what he said about the discount rate in 1933 continues, and this worry about an exit strategy is sort of swept under the rug, is a good scenario, and he seems confident it's going to happen. I feel less confident it's going to happen, or I'm scared it won't happen. And the reason I'm scared it won't happen, and part of the reason I wrote the paper, is that there is a tremendous, powerful, strong, and loud political constituency of inflation hawks primarily, who at the slightest uptick in prices or long-term tips, which is the Treasury adjusted securities, the slightest indication of the market pricing in long-term inflation expectations or actual commodity price increases take to the pages of various financial outlets, from the Financial Times to the op-ed page of the Wall Street Journal, to essentially warn that the U.S. is 6 months away from becoming Zimbabwe. And I only overstate by a little bit. There was actually a weird kind of moment in which these Treasury adjusted securities went up in the summer, and there was a spate of op-eds like this, including from Taylor, the author of the eponymous Taylor Rule. I think that the reason that this is so dangerous is precisely that the specter of 1937 looms over this entire conversation, as Carmen said in the last panel. And that is to say, there are people waiting essentially in the foyer outside the nursery holding pillows for the first opportunity to smuggle the recovery in its crib. And the logic that they will use and the argument they will make is that they are essentially defending the U.S. from something akin to Zimbabwenomics. But in the short term, the fact is the deflationary pressures are so strong, it's going to be even hard to get inflation of the kind that I'm calling for in the paper. And so these fears of this inflationary spiral in a world in which labor has very little bargaining power, et cetera, I think are just completely overblown. So that's the sort of short term. But in the long term, and this is something I talk about in the paper, and then I'll end here, I think we need to think about what exactly the period of what we might call the Great Disinflation brought us. We think about growth, and from 1948 to 1980, which was a period sort of dominated by better or worse, sort of a Keynesian consensus, the growth rate was GDP growth averaged 3.7% a year. From 1980 towards, I'm sorry, I'm reading the inflation rate. Anyway, it's in the paper. The point is that the growth rate that persists from 1948 to 1980 is higher by about a percentage point annually in GDP from the period that persists from 1980 to 2008. The inflation rate is much higher, obviously, in that first chapter than it is in the latter. In fact, President Clinton oversaw the longest period of low price stability in the history of the 20th century, and George W. Bush was number 2. The point is that that period of great disinflation, which looked before the financial crisis like it conferred all these tremendous benefits, now looks in retrospect to be partly an exacerbating factor in much of the crash that came afterwards. And so in the short term, I think this big fear is essentially smuggling the recovery into this crib. But in the long term, I think we have to re-examine why exactly 2% a year inflation, which is essentially what the Fed and everyone has kind of arrived at, is actually the right number and most coincident with long-term, robust, and broadly shared prosperity.
Thank you, Chris. We have time for some questions.
Yeah, I'm Paul London. I guess the most relevant thing is I wrote a book in 2005 about how competition in the last 2 decades kept down inflation. And the question, or the point I would make is I think the idea that with 14 million people unemployed, another 8 million people who want to work, with cement capacity at something like 53% of capacity, it's very, very hard to imagine, even if there were a lot of gold coming in from Alaska, that we would have anything like inflation for a very long time. And I think that's why what I wrote about recently was the problem of the Fed doing all of this and lending money basically to the government. The government can, the government can print money. We did it during the Civil War. We basically told the Fed during the Second World War to buy all the government debt we put out there for 2.5%. I think we just gave away the 2.5%. So I think this question of inflation is way overblown. You sort of scared people with your argument, which I think is really right on.
Thank you. Yes, Rob?
In response to your question, I think logically that's right, but one who looks at the history of the Great Depression, and I know I should probably hand the ball to the guy to my left here, but I'll also cite Jerry Epstein and Tom Ferguson's work. You see a tremendous cacophony of inflation hawks at every moment in time during the Great Depression, when the unemployment rates and so forth were also very large. So even though I think you're right, how we create social outcomes that adhere to that truth is another dimension of the challenge.
The British economist Ralph Hawtrey commented that during the Depression that worrying about inflation during the Depression is like calling fire in the middle of a flood. Liaka?
No, I think it would be great to get some inflation. I don't think it's feasible for exactly the reasons that you outlined. That I think the Fed, if it keeps interest rates at 0, will not get inflation, and that's part of the problem, and which is why we're going to have to rely on some other agency or instrument to promote a recovery.
And there are, right, so there's these two questions, right? Would inflation be beneficial? I think yes, that's my view. Can we get it? That's an open question. A lot of people say no. So I'm in the maybe category, but there have been some really interesting discussions about trying to break the lower bound, right? Which is the problem, and get to some kind of negative interest rate regime. Now that would, I mean, you think what Bernanke's doing now is radical. I mean, you want to see people freak out. That would really, but it might be actually the way to go. As someone said in the last panel, where you were saying in this panel, the Taylor rule right now is calling for a negative 2%.
Judge Schilling?
Judge Schilling again as an economist. That was very interesting, particularly what Jim was saying, and I think it's worth pointing out, and I'd like some reaction to this, that when we look at these measures, we're comparing it against GDP. Well, GDP doesn't take account of the benefits of public investment, like saving time for congestion on roads or education, things like that. It does take account of the phony profits made by the financial sector with speculation on derivatives and things like that. So I think to make these arguments more severe, how would you be able to quantify reasonably the benefits of the public investment in things to show that the economy is really gaining? So the economy has to be slightly more broadly driven. And it might affect the inflation figures too, because you're producing a lot of benefits that don't get recorded in GDP. So how we can address that, I think, would be very useful. I'd like your reactions to that.
Jim?
Yeah, one of the things I did when this whole mission got started was to go read Studs Terkel's oral history of the Depression. And one of the things that comes across very clearly in that is the absolute pride that some of the people who ran the government programs had in the quality of the accounting. That they just said no money vanished, it was all accounted for, we knew it wasn't stolen. It seems to me that we should be able to do as well. That we should be able to come up with a mechanism to put unemployed financial analysts to work, coming up with a transparent, internet-ready rating system for these projects. If you go to any of the microfinance internet sites, or any of the, there's a growing but still small direct person-to-person lending system on the internet. They're doing a pretty good job of trying to spell out what the benefits are of making that particular loan. I think expanding that model further gets you part of the way there. The other part is that, there are lots of things that GDP doesn't measure, and I think this goes to Chris's how do you create inflation if it's desirable. There are a lot of externalities that aren't included in any of these systems. I did a piece recently looking at the rare earth mining industry, which happens to be 95% of the world's rare earths come out of China right now. Well, they come out of China because basically no one else in the world can compete with the Chinese because they don't have any environmental costs. You produce rare earths by basically drilling a hole in the ground, pumping in a highly concentrated acid, pumping it back out, and putting it in a pond somewhere, and then hoping that, well, the walls in the pond don't break and no one really, lives downstream. So they put everybody else in the world out of business. So, if we're going to do this, we've got to find a way to do the accounting in a better fashion that starts to include some of these externalities. If you get externalities in and prices go up as a result, is that not equivalent to inflation?
Rob, you argued that people tend to idealize government, and what are your thoughts about the capability of the government as presently constituted to carry out large-scale projects?
Well, I guess I'm skeptical. I worked in the Senate Banking Committee and Senate Budget Committees just long enough to believe in Bismarck's old adage that you don't want to see sausage or legislation made. But I don't think being despondent is any good at all. It's about improving those mechanisms. I actually had a very refreshing experience about 18 months ago at Cooper's Union in New York. I watched Newt Gingrich debate Mario Cuomo. They did a coin flip. And after they did the coin flip, they made Gingrich go first. And he stepped up and he said, Baghdad, Katrina, we need government. We need government. Making it effective is hard, but we do need it. And these are two examples. Mario Cuomo had nothing to say for the rest of the night. So I don't know if Gingrich believed him, but he won that debate. Your question, I think, is very important, and Jim talked about measurement. In other words, improving the measurements of productivity or what you might call external benefits, spillovers that are positive. One of the areas that I'm working on right now at the Roosevelt Institute is there are a group of people from England, a man named Wilkinson in particular, who has a wonderful book called Spirit Feel, where he looks at the consequences of inequality cross-sectionally around the world and also cross-sectionally within the 50 United States. And these people are, I believe they're trained as epidemiologists. And so I don't know how we bring it into the GDP accounts, but what I'm looking at right now is there are regional disparities in how the New Deal programs were implemented. They had differential impact, and I'm looking back for the kind of data that they used to look at the cross-sectional benefits with regard to incarceration rates, mental illness, murder, infant mortality, because you can see, in other words, you can test for outcomes, not necessarily knowing exactly the conceptual chain that got you there.
In order to make sure we can start our next panel at 11:30, I think I'll cut the question short, and we'll just ask our Liaquat and Chris for their concluding thoughts.
Well, look, if the Fed is going to be a passive agency over the next few years, is it going to be the private sector that takes up the burden of getting growth going, or is it going to be the public sector? And it's clear you'd like both. I'm very sympathetic to the idea of a massive program of infrastructure investment. What would be great is if we could figure out a way for that to be privatized. And if we could find a way for these externalities to be internalized so that the investors could gain a benefit, because that way you don't have to put it through the federal budget, you can do it through limited partnerships, etc.
Chris?
I would just conclude by saying I think the first job of central bankers in monetary policy, and this comes both from Liaquat's excellent book, which I would also plug, is truly tremendous book, really brilliant and a great read, and also from Friedman and Schwartz, is just first do no harm. And there's tremendous potential for harm to be done if the Fed were to sort of buckle to these cries that are coming from the corners. Beyond that, even what Bernanke's been doing so far, so routinely now called revolutionary radical, it sort of portions off some truly radical things that we could do in the monetary sphere that might need to be pursued down the road.
Please join me in thanking our panelists.